Chapter 841. The airship in the stratosphere was in the nighttime region. It was pitch black outside and there was nothing to see. Many passengers had taken off their sunshades, preparing to take a long nap and get used to the jet lag. At least that was the case half a minute ago. The shock wave of the bomb of terror in the first-class cabin shattered the beautiful dreams of quite a few people. But what truly caused the passengers to wake up and go into an uproar was the endless, all-encompassing, unstoppable bright light. In this instant, it didn't matter if it was the thin sunshades or the thick outer shell of the airship. It didn't matter if it was the clear-headed eyewitnesses or the confused, frightened passengers. Everything was illuminated by the strong light. The inner walls of the outer shell, the skin, the bones, and the flesh, everything became transparent and even nothingness. Within the airship, all shadows were instantly swept away. Then what was erased were the differences between people, between objects, and even between objects. There were only panicked and petty souls that tumbled and screamed within the boundless strong light. Even though it was only for an instant and it was like an illusion, it still exceeded the limits of what the vast majority of people could endure. The commotion on the airship got out of hand. Bai Xinyan still maintained her bowed posture, but she instinctively pulled in her shoulders and elbows. He shrunk a bit. As a woman, the feeling of being illuminated inside and out was truly terrible. But she could understand that this was the manifestation of the true gods of the Amaterasu order, the projection of power across space. It was just as the bastard who ran away said. This place wasn't that far from Ban City. 1,400 kilometers. As long as there was a tiny fulcrum, the two experts of the Amaterasu order could easily project their consciousness and power here. The only difference was the length of time and the intensity of the projection. Right now it looked like the two of the Amaterasu order were yin and yang. One was restrained and the other was unrestrained. Even the so-called restraint was only relative. In that case, had Luo Nen managed to escape from the pincer attack of the Pope of 100 Collections and true god Qianju? What do you think of this scene as compared to a daydream? A flat voice came into her ears. It didn't even bother to raise the question. It was because the voice was too flat that Bai Xinyan was unable to understand it immediately. She subconsciously asked, "What?" Only then did she realize that the person who had just spoken to her was the Pope of the 100 Communities. The second in command of the Amaterasu cult, who had descended from the sky, manipulated the puppet, which was obviously unwieldy, to raise its wrist to look at its watch. There was indeed a watch on the puppet's wrist and it showed the time in Osaka. 22:17:45. After confirming the time, the Pope finally moved the puppet and continued to move forward. He passed by a few trembling bodyguards as well as Yukawa Isuk and Yamakabe Xiaohui who had fallen to the ground. Finally he adjusted his posture and sat on the seat that Yukawa Isuk was sitting on. After sitting down he no longer had to worry about maintaining his balance. His body language was more relaxed and he was more like the one Bai Xinyan was familiar with except for his face. While Bai Xinyan was evaluating the situation in her mind, the gaze from the other side was cast over again. Bai Xinyan also remembered that she had not yet answered the question of the Pope of Baiji. She tried to organize her words, but the other side asked again without a care in the world. I mean, Qiji's move just now, how is it different from the feeling of the white nightmare a few days ago? Bai Xinyan seemed to be able to hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. She could almost hear the sound of the bodyguard's waist bones and knees cracking. Bai Xinyan was no longer surprised. She just couldn't understand why the Pope of the 100 Assemblies would suddenly ask such a completely unrelated question. The White Nightmare, May 7th Osaka time, was an accident that affected the entire world. It was still rippling across the Pacific Ocean to this day and was still in the ascendant. Because she was in the Eastern Hemisphere at that time, Bai Xinyan did not feel too much about it. Presumably, the Pope of the 100 Communities also knew. He was probably asking for the opinion of the person behind her. Bai Xinyan suddenly realized that she needed to adjust the priority of the White Nightmare incident. For the Pope of the 100 Communities to specifically ask about it, the impact on the inner world was no different from the Light of the Polar Domain incident at the end of last year. However, the Pope of the 100 Communities was destined to be disappointed. Bai Xinyan bowed and replied, Xinyan's skills are insufficient and my memory of that day is also blurred. It's difficult to compare. The Pope of the 100 Communities did not show any obvious disappointment or anger. Even if there was, it would not show on the puppet's face. In the time it took for these 2 or 3 sentences to be exchanged, the powerful light that illuminated everything had already disappeared. The outside of the porthole was still bright, as if they could no longer return to the natural nighttime. However, under the illumination of the bright light, the roiling clouds in the sky seemed to be even denser. Even though they were illuminated by the strong light, they still slapped against the porthole, changing shape and reminding people they were still tens of thousands of feet high in the sky, still one of the areas with the densest concentration of water vapor in the world. Bai Xinyan noticed the changes outside the porthole, and unconsciously became somewhat absent-minded. Up until now, this area had not experienced too obvious of an impact or turbulence, but just by looking at the interaction between the strong light and the sea of clouds, she could draw some conclusions and judgments. At this moment, she heard the Pope of the 100 Communities sigh, the condensation ring, truly a divine technique that should not have appeared on Earth. Bai Xinyan shivered slightly and turned her gaze back, just in time to see the slightly red eyes of the Pope of the 100 Communities puppets. The latter swept a glance over her body, but finally focused on her side. Bai Xinyan subconsciously followed the Pope of the 100 Communities' focus, and her gaze fell on her own feet. It was a suitcase that was lying flat in front of her seat. This thing was originally placed neatly on the inside of the seat, but because the airship had lost its balance and was in the process of righting itself, it had fallen out. This is a mimicry generator. The Pope of the 100 Communities' voice was very certain, and he even used the puppet's toe to kick the unconscious Yukawa Isuk on the ground. He made a last-minute report, but there was no follow-up. His intentions are clear as day. Next to him, Kitano Sakito's eyelids were already twitching because of the Pope of the 100 Communities' actions, and he unconsciously shivered when he heard this. He opened his mouth to explain, but his mouth opened and closed a few times, but he did not have the strength to make a sound. Bai Xinyan, on the other hand, smiled. Otherwise, he would say that His Majesty is magnanimous. As soon as she finished speaking, the torrential rain and distorted light slapped against the porthole and the outer armor of the airship. In response, there was a dull explosion outside, and the hoarse noise of the airship's structure creaking and disorderly. The people on the airship could even feel the obvious drift. The surging force in the strong light and clouds pushed the airship sideways for some distance. There was no doubt that from the cockpit to the economy cabin, there was another wave of exclamations and howls. The Pope of the 100 Communities looked at his watch again. 20 minutes and 4 seconds. Turn it on, we'll take a look. Chapter 842. Isn't that inappropriate? Bai Xinyan did not refuse. He was just puzzled. Regardless of how Luonan managed to deal with the encirclement and interception of true gods for over 2 minutes, it was easy to imagine that the area where the two sides wrestled was not on the material plane. On the mental plane, it was undoubtedly the Abyss region. The mimicry map generator produced a mimicry map of the mental sea. As its name implied, it could only be used in the mental sea. There was an insurmountable distance between it and the main battlefield in the Abyss region. Moreover, this was just a simulator. The lag was quite strong. It was not suitable for use in actual combat. The Pope of Chiji did not speak again. He just used the puppet's scarlet eye to cut across Bai Xinyan's face. Bai Xinyan was not going to be stubborn about this issue. She shrugged, bent over, and placed the suitcase back on the seat. She opened the suitcase, turned it on, and connected it to the projector. It was certainly not as effective as the one on Ishik Yukawa's private airship, but the dense bubble scene still appeared. Bai Xinyan swept her eyes over the various parameters displayed in the projection area. She spoke truthfully, the debugging will take some time. There was another part of her that she did not say. Perhaps this high-level interception battle would have ended before the debugging was completed. The Pope of Chiji still did not speak. The puppet that carried his consciousness even narrowed its eyes. It looked like it was taking a nap. Of course, it was more likely that it was sensing the situation of the battle outside the airship. Bai Xinyan's communication was fruitless. She could only settle her mind and proceed with the debugging process bit by bit. But just as she said, this was not a problem that could be solved in a minute or two. On the other hand, the curtain of intense light outside the airship grew more and more intense. Faint rumbling sounds of thunder could be heard. At first, it sounded like it was hundreds of kilometers away, but in the blink of an eye, it was within reach. It shook the airship's window until it hummed. It seemed as if it would collapse and disintegrate in the next moment. It's been over 3 minutes. Bai Xinyan paid more attention to the battle outside. At first glance, the momentum of this battle was astonishing, but in fact, in terms of intensity, it was far from the strongest. The rhythm of the explosions was intermittent, and there was a high probability that it was a chase. But once the chase started, it would be endless. Was there a limit to being a true god? Or was Luonan too cunning? Or perhaps... You haven't finished debugging yet? The one who spoke was Kitano Sakuto. The head bodyguard walked over quietly and spoke in a low voice. His original tough and professional demeanor was almost gone. Without the hint from the Pope of Hyakanji, Kitano Sutoto would not have come here just to investigate. After all, it was just a matter of opening his mouth. Did the Pope of Hyakanji need to put on airs like this? Bai Xinyan's drifting consciousness came back. He turned around to see what was going on. However, Kitano Sukito happened to block her line of sight. She could only exchange glances with Kitano Sukito and shake her head slightly, signaling him to pay attention to the surrounding environment. At this time, the cries from the business class and economy class had vaguely spread to the upper deck. Along with the shapeless corpses and unconscious and limp bodies, it looked like a scene from the end of the world. The collective emotional state is in a mess and the spiritual sea is in chaos. The changes are too intense. Moreover, the computing power of a portable instrument is difficult to support the speed and precision of analysis at the same time. It's not suitable for actual combat. This was said to Kitano Sutoto, but it was also an explanation for the Pope of Hakuji. I'll bring it over. But Bai Xinyan did not understand at first. Kitano Sutoto's eyelids drooped, and his eyes were almost invisible, but his movements were direct and clear. He reached out and picked up the mimicry generator, that was still in a state of adjustment. He held it up respectfully, turned around and took 2 steps to present it to the Pope. At this time, Bai Xinyan finally saw the current state of the Pope of Hakuji. The puppet that he had possessed was sitting in a somewhat casual posture. His legs were spread wide, his elbows on his knees, and his upper body was supported. However, the curve of his back was still bent and his head was also drooping. His right hand naturally clasped his left wrist, and his fingertips tapped unconsciously on his wrist. He looked like he was thinking but also looked a little tired. As for the mimicry generator that was already in his hand, he did not pay attention to it immediately. He still maintained his posture and no one knew what he was thinking. Compared to the image of a god and its spokesperson that could not be looked at directly and could not be communicated with, this kind of behavior that was similar to a real life was more or less a buffer for the fragile hearts of the surrounding bodyguards. Therefore, probably because of Kitano Sutoto's arrangement, the bodyguards began to work. They were trying to settle Yukawa Aisuk and Yamashita Xiahui, who were stacked together at the feet of the Pope of Hakuji. At present, they had already carried Yukawa Aisuk away and placed him on the front row seat. They were about to carry Yamashita Xiahui away when the tip of a polished leather boot suddenly tapped on his side shoulder. The leather boot belonged to the Pope of Hakuji. Puppet. Sup. Kitano Sutoto, who was still holding the mimicry generator, reacted quickly and called for it to stop immediately. Everyone's movements froze for a moment. Only the Pope of Hakuji controlled the puppet to extend its hand and use it to replace the tip of the boot to press on Yamashita Xiahui's shoulder. Bai Xinyan narrowed her eyes. Although the entire process was not long, she could see, and the others could also see, that the Pope puppet's fingertip was clearly trembling. Even when it pressed on Yamashita Xiahui's shoulder, it only calmed down a little. She roughly understood why the Pope of Hakuji was putting on airs. For an extraordinary high-intensity output from more than 1,400 kilometers away was not that easy to deal with. Without a solid fulcrum, the puppet had strength but was unable to use it. It also needed to perform micromanipulation to avoid bursting the small water pipe. From this, it could be seen that the majority of the Pope of Hakuji's energy was consumed on this. Even so, the problem of accelerated depreciation was unavoidable. The puppet's outstretched hand maintained a pressing posture on Yamashita Xiahui's shoulder for over 10 seconds. During this time, the puppet's skin was clearly red. Fine sweat seeped out of its pores and there were even faint specks of blood. It was only because the puppet had a drunken appearance that it was not overly eye-catching. But even with such strength, Yamashita Xiahui didn't show any reaction. This technique. Bai Xinyan lowered her eyes. She made a hypothesis based on this. If the Pope of Hakuji had the support of a B-rank psychic like Yamashita Xiaohui, then the Pope of Hakuji would certainly be much more relaxed than he was right now. But Yamada Xiaohui had fainted and he seemed to be quite heavy. It was hard to say who would be at a disadvantage if they were to fight a protracted battle like this. Luo Nan's grasp of the situation and his control of the details was much more experienced than imagined. It was as if he was exchanging blows with extraordinaries from time to time. Where did he accumulate this experience and insight from? At this time, Bai Xinyan heard the puppet's breathing. It was as if there was a tube of iron sand in its throat, making a rustling sound. She relied on her many years of experience in researching the human body. Her first judgment was that Xiaohui had developed severe symptoms of laryngeal edema. Eliminating the cause of infection, his heart and kidney functions were most likely abnormal. Under the strong pressure, the internal organs of the human body had suffered irreversible damage, and the damage was continuing to worsen. There was no possibility of relief. Bai Xinyan was able to discern so much information due to her personal ability level. The others didn't have this ability. They could only passively wait. In particular, the bodyguard who was preparing to move Yamashita Xiaohui maintained a half-squatting posture. He didn't dare to move. He waited for over 10 seconds and all he got was the Pope puppet's sigh. He felt a dry sensation suddenly press against the top of his head. He seemed to hear a cry of alarm, or perhaps it was the sound of the explosion outside the window. Then, it was meaningless to him. All sounds in the first-class cabin disappeared. The Pope puppet's sigh also disappeared. At the same time, the symptoms of laryngeal edema also disappeared. At the very least, it was temporarily alleviated. The price was the bodyguard who had fallen onto Yamashita Xiaohui. That person's skin and flesh were already limp. There was no breath left. The way he died was no different from the Maikawa Vice Minister of Affairs. The surrounding bodyguards all had deathly pale faces. As full-time members of the Yuchuan family, they had seen quite a few situations of internal handling. But this kind of situation where they were treated as a power bank was truly unprecedented. The important question was, whose turn would it be next? The hearts of the people were in turmoil, but now was not the time to pacify them. Whether it was Bai Xinyan or Kitano Sukito, neither of them cared about these things. From their perspective, what they needed to pay more attention to was the new clear instructions the Pope of 100 Gatherings made after helping the puppet catch its breath. The hand that had just reaped a life flipped over. Its palm faced upwards and it hooked its finger. Kitano Sukito's reaction was maintained at a high standard. He bent down again and, with absolute respect, handed over the mimicry generator. It was also at this time that he saw a cluster of greenish-black veins appear on the palm. It looked like the expanding capillaries under the skin, but it was more like the shadow of a tree with branches growing horizontally. Within the dark veins, there was clearly light flowing, filled with a different kind of vitality. But just thinking about its most likely source made one shudder. Kitano Sukito instinctively wanted to keep his distance from the Pope puppet. He wanted to retreat after completing his task. But the latter had no intention of taking over. Perhaps it felt that the distance and height were just right, so it simply used Kitano Sukito as a table. It stretched its hand over the control area of the device and began to operate it. Kitano Sukito's pupils dilated as he watched the Pope puppet's fingertips switch back and forth between the virtual interface and the physical buttons. Especially with the appearance of a business elite, he looked quite professional when he did such actions. But as long as one thought about the true identity, status, and image of the Pope, there was an element of absurdity in it. And as the Pope puppet operated, the mimicry image of the spiritual sea, in the projection area connected to the device, began to change repeatedly. The colorful water droplets constantly adjusted the angle of presentation, and at the same time the colors quickly faded, forming a general grayish-white base tone. Kitano Sukito did not quite understand what this change meant. He subconsciously turned to look at Bai Xinyan, but he saw that Bai Xinyan's gaze had drifted to Yukawa Aishuk, who had just been seated in the front row. Bai Xinyan also noticed Kitano Sukito's gaze, but she had no intention of explaining. She moved her gaze away from Yukawa Aishuk and switched back and forth between the device and the projection area. She knew, and she had even explained to Yukawa Aishuk earlier, that this kind of change was a result of the repetitive spiritual waves in the surrounding area and the changes that had already become a routine. It was presented as the regular background radiation. This was also a sign that the initial analysis of the mimicry picture had been completed. Last time in Osaka, Bai Xinyan had spent at least 20 minutes to achieve this step. Even if the sensing range was wider this time and the processing of more data, the difference was too obvious in comparison. Bai Xinyan could confirm that this device was directly sent over from the deep blue world. It was a product of the laboratory and it had not been put into the market. Perhaps this was the only one on Earth. Then where did the super operating ability of the Pope of the 100 Collections come from? Was it born with knowledge? Such thoughts could be written into the scriptures of the Church, but in the real world it was better to use reasoning. From the simple background of the device, if the problem was not in the application or the circulation, then the problem could only be in the research and development stage. According to her understanding, the Apocalypse Laboratory had obtained inspiration from Luo Nan's cage theory to develop this device. They hoped to use it as a key tool to break the barriers that ordinary people had to the spiritual plane. They wanted to make it into a commercial hit and lay the foundation for the next step of their grand plan. The so-called return on investment, the small profit operation, and the like were just excuses to deal with investors like Yukawa Aishik. As for what the grand plan was, Bai Xinyan did not know the full picture. She only heard that the laboratory attached great importance to it, and that even Li Wei was deeply involved in the research and development. But now it seemed that Li Wei was not the only one participating in the research and development. The relationship between the Apocalypse Laboratory and the Amaterasu Order was no longer concealed. Yukawa Aishik had indeed played the worst trick. Focus. A low and hoarse voice flowed out from the throat of the Pope puppet. It was directed at Bai Xinyan. Your Majesty? You'll be the one operating from now on. Make sure that the interface is maintained on this baseline. The Pope puppet did not even raise its head. The arrangement was a matter of course. The slight loss of voice at the end proved that the organ tissue of the throat had not completely recovered. It was impossible for it to recover. It was only a matter of time before it collapsed. Perhaps it was because of this that the Pope of the 100 Collections did not play any tricks. She spoke very clearly. Qinju exerts force through the abyss region. Distance isn't a problem, but it is very difficult to accurately lock onto Luo Nan. Luo Nan previously reversed-sealed the Magatama configuration and Xia Hui on the back of the mountain, cutting off our path of descent. His methods are brilliant, but it is hard to avoid revealing traces. We have grabbed onto a piece of his tail, but it is too insubstantial. It jumps back and forth between the material plane and the mental plane. Qinju probed down from the abyss region to the material plane, causing a large loss in precision. He needs me to act as the signal tower's relay gain. Only then can he encircle and intercept Luo Nan. Luo Nan knows all of this. He will most likely do something. The Pope of the 100 Collections operated the apparatus as she explained. In this way, Bai Xinyan had a clear understanding of the distorted bubbles of colorful light that gradually grew on the ash-gray background. Frankly speaking, it was a nesting doll structure. The innermost layer of the bubble was the signal tower of the Pope puppet. It appeared weak and fleeting, as if it could collapse at any time. The middle layer warped and fluctuated, flickering indefinitely. Specks of light would appear from time to time, but they did not form a shape. This was most likely the impact of the battle between the two sides. The details were no longer something that the mimicry diagram could analyze. The outermost layer was supported by a bubble. This bubble was much more stable, forming a boundary that was not a boundary. Perhaps this was the control domain of a true god's extraordinary power? Of course, everything displayed here was just a mimicry on the mental C-plane. Let's not talk about accuracy. In essence, it was just the area swept by the aftermath. The main battlefield between Luo Nan and a true god was still the abyss region. Understand? His Majesty is using himself as bait. Bai Xinyan was just being polite. The Pope had only used a pious believer puppet. It was not even an ability user. How could it be considered bait? If Luo Nan really wanted to pull the firewood out from the bottom of the cauldron, then the true unlucky ones would be them, the passengers of the airship, if there was a slight deviation in the application of power. However, this possibility was meaningless to the Pope of the 100 Collections. What he paid attention to was on a completely different level than the others. The puppet raised its head and stared at Bai Xinyan with its scarlet eyes. Protect the apparatus. Collect data. If Qianju is unable to obtain the results of the battle, this place needs to be maintained for at least 200 seconds. The mimicry generator will transmit the data to the laboratory's cloud. We need to clearly see his foundation. We need to clearly see what he's hiding behind his back. Yes. Bai Xinyan agreed. But she had a feeling that the Pope of the 100 Collections was not talking to her. Instead, he was shouting at Luo Nan, whose whereabouts were unknown within the boundless clouds. It was like a threat, but it was also like a lure. Chapter 843. Yin Lu arrived at Luo Nan's rented studio on the dot. Even though Luo Nan hadn't had a normal work and rest schedule for several days in a row, as long as she was his personal secretary, she absolutely couldn't neglect the morning and evening work. She first pressed the intercom outside the workshop, but there was no response. Only then did she verify her fingerprint to enter. The lights of the workshop were on, and the lights and shadows of the virtual work area were fluctuating. Luo Nan sat behind the workbench with one hand supporting his cheek. His figure was frozen, he should be concentrating on his work. However, when he took 2 more steps forward and took a closer look, he discovered that the man's eyes were closed and his breathing was slow. He had actually fallen asleep while maintaining this posture. He probably couldn't take it anymore after working continuously. Yinlu didn't dare to wake Luo Nan up. She just scanned the workshop to see if there was anything that needed to be cleaned up. That moving shelf didn't exist before. Now it was placed in the middle of the room. It was very conspicuous. Something must have been placed there earlier. It was likely that the veteran had been here before. Yinlu moved the mobile rack to the corner and quietly walked to the workbench. She didn't dare to touch the tools and instruments on the stage. She could only pick up some small things and even took photos to locate them. She didn't want anything to go wrong and she couldn't recover them. It was also at this time that she glanced at the virtual work area. The picture she saw was very familiar. It was like a bottomless sea or a storm on the surface of the sea. It was thick and colorful and the structure was chaotic. In fact, it was made up of 2 overlapping pictures. 2 psychic diagrams. The reason why Yinlu was certain of this was because she had seen Luo Nan dismantle and integrate before. Moreover, most of the things she had been busy with recently came from this. It was hard for Yinlu to notice such a complicated and profound diagram. However, she noticed that the whole picture was fluctuating rhythmically, as if it was an interwoven picture of the ocean that was gradually seeping into the real world and becoming a substantial existence. Yinlu was startled, but she soon realized that it might be a misconception. This was because there was a certain amount of distortion and refraction of light in the surroundings of the sleeping Luo Nan. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that the air was fluctuating, resulting in an illusion. Luo Nan wasn't resting. He was cultivating, right? Was there a need to be so desperate? Yinlu couldn't help but recall the letter she had sent to Mrs. Halder, which described her doubts and judgment. Luo Nan, this new boss of hers, had his sights set on the target. The enemy he targeted far exceeded the scope of what should have been. This forced him to never stop moving forward. Instead, he seized every moment and opportunity to improve himself. He was as taut as a humming bowstring. He might shoot a deadly arrow at any time, but he might also snap on his own. Yinlu sighed. Her breath was still lingering in her mouth when a rustling sound rang out at the same time. Behind the workbench, the chair on Luo Nan's body suddenly collapsed without any warning. The wooden body of the chair and the soft cushion on the seat disintegrated into fine dust, and some of the plastic and metal parts were twisted and cracked. At the same time, they were restrained by a certain force, which erased the kinetic energy of the disintegration. They fell in a straight line and fell to the ground. Yinlu was startled. "Sir." The moment she spoke those words, she felt that there were too many similar exclamations. But when the impact came, what could she do? And this time the shout had some effect. Luo Nan opened his eyes at this time. As for his body, it floated in midair, maintaining its original natural state without any undulation. "Sir." Yinlu called out in a probing manner. "Oh, you're here." Luo Nan looked as if he had just woken up. He floated in midair, unfolded his body and stretched his waist. But his eyes were as bright as stars. He didn't have the hazy appearance of someone who had just woken up. Yinlu was very curious as to what Luo Nan had been doing, but she couldn't really ask. She could only go with the flow and say, "It's almost 10:30. Sir, do you want to go back and rest?" "Oh, it doesn't matter if I rest or not. I can't stay here for now." It wasn't easy to calibrate the equipment. I might have to start all over again. Really? Lu responded with her mouth, but in her mind she thought of the fluctuating air around Luo Nan. Luo Nan's feet didn't touch the ground. His body turned a few times and he sat on the wheelchair next to the workbench. He entered into the disabled mode, which required someone to serve him. Li's eyes were still engraved with the image of his natural turning and turning, of his figure that didn't have the slightest trace of smoke and fire. It was unknown how much more brilliant it was than when he used the electromagnetic configuration to propel his fleshly body to float in midair. But when she thought about it in detail, only 2 weeks had passed in between. This degree of improvement. Lu sighed silently. She consciously went behind the wheelchair and did what she needed to do. But when she exerted force, the wheelchair actually became heavy and sluggish. It didn't move at all. What's wrong with this? I almost forgot. I can't take a car in my current situation. Let's walk back. What's your situation? Lu finally found the opportunity to seek knowledge and dispel her doubts. She subconsciously made a guess. Did you have another breakthrough in your cultivation? Nope. I was just playing a game. You can't take it seriously. Lu was at a loss out of habit. The wheelchair beneath Luo Nan didn't need her to exert force at this time. It automatically moved forward and left the room. Lu hurried to catch up. She could confirm that this wasn't the work of the motor built into the wheelchair. Luo Nan ignored the commercial car parked outside after leaving the workshop. He directly controlled the wheelchair to move forward. Lu arranged for the driver to go ahead first. She walked with small steps in her high heels. She followed behind him with clattering sounds. It was close to midnight in the Ping trade market. Even in the central area, there were very few pedestrians. The streets were empty, looking quite refreshing. But Luo Nan said, "How impatient." He narrowed his eyes as he spoke. A portion of the soul cloak spread out for thousands of kilometers, tens of thousands of kilometers. Hot bubbles bulged out from the intense light and high temperature. It was like a blazing furnace, roasting the slight fishy smell of the clouds and sea into a complex sensory stimulation. It was transmitted over a distance of 1,500 kilometers. He sensed it, experienced it, and responded to it. Of course, it was just as Luo Nan said. This series of senses was more like the stimulation of a virtual game, and it was a low degree of simulation. It was a bit like the déjà vu of an external neuron taking an offline test. He wasn't even as nervous as he was back then. If he didn't pass the test, he would most likely be in big trouble. Right now, the soul cloak was restraining and resisting him. He was playing hide-and-seek with a true god in the abyssal region. He arranged a few configurations within the clouds and watched them live and die. He didn't care much about winning or losing. It was just like the Pope of 100 Collections who claimed to use her body as bait. What tense situation. It was all just talk. How could he be taken seriously? Well, for Bai Xinyan and the other people involved, this wasn't wrong. Only Luo Nan wouldn't. He couldn't do this. Chapter 844. The distance from the studio located at the center of the peaceful trade market to the yacht dock was approximately 5 kilometers. Whether it was Luo Nan or Lu, neither of them took this distance seriously. The two slowly walked forward, one in front and one behind, amidst the sound of rubber wheels and high heels hitting the road surface. Lu still did not understand Luo Nan's words. However, as they walked, she naturally assumed the position of a personal secretary. She held the handle behind the wheelchair, even though it did not have any practical meaning. Lu was still pondering over Luo Nan's theory of playing games. She could not understand the logic behind it no matter how hard she tried. She pondered for a kilometer before she heard Luo Nan's voice. "You were once the manager of Frost River Reality. How do you deal with those guys who cheat in games?" This. How do you deal with those guys who cheat and want to PK with real people? Lu stared blankly for a few seconds before she finally decided to say what was on her mind. Basically, you deal with them by suspending their accounts. In some cases, you'll use security and the police. Sometimes, you'll even apply to the SCA to lower the social privileges of those people. You'll ban them from entering relevant places and so on. Heh. It's quite difficult to find the SCA at that level. Luo Nan laughed and sighed. It was just as he said. Right now he was playing a game. When it came to game skills, he and the two from the Amaterasu order could not determine who was superior due to the short amount of time they had spent together. However, Luonan occupied two advantages. One was the advantage of misplaced information. Luonan knew how the true god and the Pope participated. He knew their methods and calculations. Though those two had locked onto a Luonan, it was only an illusory phantom. An enormous error had appeared in their critical judgment. The other advantage was the bandwidth advantage. Luonan relied on the ability of the soul cloak to cover the entire world. He occupied an absolute advantage in terms of energy conduction and utilization. He also sealed off the preset signal tower a step earlier. While the true god and the Pope were still calculating whether or not there was a signal, Luonan relied on the ubiquitous water molecules to construct the global Internet of Things. He enjoyed the convenience of zero-time delay. Luonan did not know how he would lose if he simply played games under these conditions. The problem lay in the fact that the Pope and the true god were sore losers. They didn't really want to PK with Luonan's gaming techniques. Their goal from the very beginning was to lock onto Luonan's position in reality through the game within the clouds. This was to prepare for the offline real-life PK. This was very shameless. From Luonan's perspective, it didn't matter whether he won or lost the game. In any case, he had already achieved his goal of warning by Xinyan and Yukawa Aishuk. But if the two from the Amaterasu order locked onto Luonan's true location and confirmed that the target was hiding in their base, they would not be able to win. Yin Lu and Snake Tongue, who were by Luonan's side, as well as Old Hand and the group of vagrants who had a close relationship with Luonan's grandfather, would most likely not be able to survive once the conflict erupted. From another point of view, the reason why the true gods and the Pope still had some misgivings in their headquarters, Ban City, and had to travel over 1,000 kilometers to verify their findings was also because of the existence of the source of interference. In their eyes, there should be a difference between Luonan and the source of interference, especially since Luonan was following closely behind the airship. The influence of the spacetime interference still existed in Ban City. This was more or less a new piece of evidence. At the very least, they did not think that there was no human figure riding a devil ray running and hiding in the hazy sea and sky 1,500 kilometers away. Even if they had their suspicions, they still needed further confirmation. With this analysis, the things Luonan needed to do were quite clear. He needed to maintain his advantage. He needed to interfere with the verification methods of the true god and the Pope. He needed to let the existing misunderstanding continue to exist. It would be best if he stayed away from reality and created layers of confusion. He needed to lure the two off topic and have some fear. Of course, he absolutely could not overreach himself and allow the other side to grab hold of his weakness. Luonan was very cautious. It was true that he occupied a certain information advantage. But ultimately, he was not sure what the two from the Amaterasu order were basing their judgment on. He did not know where they came from. Especially the true god who had run back to Ban City after screaming out that his soul had been magnetized. His understanding of the situation definitely exceeded the scope of normal Earth knowledge. Luonan wanted to think things over carefully, but this was not something he was good at. He could not find anyone to advise him. The conversation with Yin Lu just now was just a joke to adjust his mood. This was the result of stuffing a belly full of secrets. Luckily, the conversation between the Pope and Bai Xinyan gave Luonan an opening to take advantage of the situation. Didn't they say that I was nearby? Then I'll be nearby. He would not be able to hide it sooner or later if he just fooled around in the air. He needed to add a bit more to it. During the night stroll, Luonan carefully combed through his thoughts in his mind. He roughly sorted out the required configuration design. Then he extended his hand and waved behind him. You still have the one I gave you last time, right? Huh. Yin Lu, who had been stunned by Luonan's question, instantly became nervous. Mister, which one are you talking about? It's that fish. Luonan subconsciously lowered his voice when he said the three key syllables. He was a bit mysterious. The Devil Ray was a secret that absolutely could not be exposed in Ban City. Yin Lu had a serious expression. She had never seen Luonan speak with this sort of tone before. Many thoughts flashed through her mind in an instant. She calmed her mind with great difficulty and lowered her voice. Yes, mister. You. Luonan didn't say much. He just waved his 5 fingers. His meaning was very clear. Yin Lu immediately picked up her bag and wanted to take out the crystal ball, with the Devil Ray sealed inside. But her vigilant mentality made her remember something. She hesitated for a moment before handing over the entire purse. Her body leaned forward, and her lips nearly stuck to Luo Nan's ear as she apologized. I'll have to trouble Mister to take a look. Don't take it out for now. I've had a lot of eyes these past 2 days. Oh, that's right. The Deep Blue Walker Squadron, which was his yacht's neighbor, had put in quite a bit of effort these past few days. It was a bit better in the studio, but in a public place, there might be several surveillance cameras pointing at them. It's too early to talk about this. Luo Nan reflected on himself for a moment. He readily followed the advice and opened the purse to search for his target. From his perspective, the lady's purse was more or less a small maze. He could clearly sense the location of the crystal ball, but the complicated design of the purse still tormented him quite a bit. A minute later, Luo Nan extended his hand into the Kuan bag and finally grasped the crystal ball. He felt the marvelous sensation of the crystal ball being indistinguishable between real and illusory. He also felt the instant information that belonged to the devil ray transmitted from the void in between layers. He made a series of fine adjustments to the configuration outline in his mind. Chapter 845. What are these B** stars doing? Captain Jimmy crossed his arms in front of his chest and subconsciously tapped his feet. The rapid rhythm reflected his current terrible mood. At this time he was supposed to be preparing for tonight's operation, but an unexpected incident had ruined all his preparations. The surveillance resources that had been fully activated had been reduced to something akin to catching an adulterer in the act. For the time being, no one could give him a response. From his deputy Mendez to the surrounding members of the action team, and the SCA officials who had just rushed over to work overtime but were proven to be a waste of time, they all averted their gazes to avoid the unfortunate incident. 2 minutes ago, a video from an intercontinental passenger airship began to spread on the internet. The suspected terrorist attack that happened in the first-class cabin of the airship was recorded from different angles by many witnesses, posted on different social media accounts, and linked with big data. It began to rapidly accumulate views and influence. Until now, there was still no clear explanation for the incident. In fact, even if a nuclear bomb exploded on the airship, Captain Jimmy would not care. The key problem was that Xianxia, who was at the last point of the parallel approval process, was in the area where the incident occurred, and there was still no news of her. The operation approval process was once again stuck. Captain Jimmy felt like he was tripped. It did not hurt him, but it was very depressing. The mission against the remnants of the Soul Cult was actually not difficult, nor was it urgent or challenging. The reason why Captain Jimmy could not forget about it was largely because he wanted to compete with Xianxia. He did not deny this. He finally had the opportunity to use the situation and the procedure to force Xianxia to yield. Victory was in sight, but something like this happened. What kind of luck did Xianxia have? Whether it was reasonable or not, that was what Captain Jimmy thought in his heart. The procedure went into a standstill again. Captain Jimmy had no choice but to pay attention to the development of the incident and try to learn the truth from the higher-ups. At the same time, he diverted some attention to the B***-starred couple on the street. No matter what, these two were the people who had the most contact with the target, the veteran Zhou Xian and the other vagrants. In other words, they were also suspects. Even if they had the blood flame order behind them. Captain Jimmy kicked the chair under the intelligence officers and tried to make his subordinates nervous again. Give me the plan. The one numbered A7. To deal with indirect suspects like Mr. Mo, whose background was clear but whose identity was unknown, the operation team also had a contingency plan. When the captain had nothing to do, he could go on a vacation. The bitter intelligence and staff officers could only crawl on the grid and write plans to satisfy the captain's desire to dominate. Jimmy, let's wait for the news. Seeing Captain Jimmy's behavior, Mender knew that Captain Jimmy wanted to take a different approach. Therefore he tried to dissuade him. There should be a result on the airship soon. I'm just waiting and making preparations. In front of his subordinates, Captain Jimmy maintained the dignity of a supervisor. Even if the procedure is completed and we start to move from the close contact between this adulterous couple and Zhou Xian, there is a high chance that they will interfere. Look, that woman is on the phone talking to her lover. Boy, show me the surveillance records from the past few days. The last sentence was again addressed to the intelligence clerk. While retrieving the information, Captain Jimmy said to the SCA's Minister O'Hara, "It would be perfect if we could get their phone records." Minister O'Hara's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond to Captain Jimmy's words and actions that violated the law. He could only pretend that he was deaf and mute. Captain Jimmy didn't force him further. Now wasn't the time to be serious. He only compared the surveillance records to find evidence for himself. From the surveillance records, our technical maniac Mr. Mo has been working hard in the studio for the past few days. Why couldn't he stay there tonight? Oh, and the big news on the airship just happened. All right, Captain Jimmy's every word exuded an aura of looking for trouble. This was already the consensus of everyone present, but no one dared to point it out. Captain Jimmy, on the other hand, felt good about it, so his words became more and more outrageous. This Mr. MOT City still hasn't found an accurate explanation for why the Blood Flame Order's deputy high priest is so willing to be submissive. Is he actually Lady Halder's lover, or is he the result of that person's sex change? Cough cough. With outsiders around, Dor didn't want to speak carelessly and leave something that could be used against him. He tried his best to find more information. From the intelligence, the Blood Flame Order's madam has always been cold and ruthless. He's also a bit mysterious. Maybe this is her backup plan. Backup plan? He has such a high-profile backup plan. It's not that bad. Anyone under the spotlight has to expose something. Then what did he expose? Ko Island. Buddy, do you remember that place? Yes. In the few days that the operation had been stalled, the operation team could only put in more effort into intelligence work. So far, they had already obtained enough information from Mr. Neo and knew that Claw Island was the secret tunnel that the remnants of the Soul Order used to infiltrate. At the same time, they also knew that the island in the lake and the half-abandoned base on it were rented by this Mr. Mo. They even went up to investigate, but other than a bunch of exoskeleton parts and some strange compound materials, they didn't find anything new. Not finding anything is the prelude to a great discovery. Captain Jimmy could come up with over 100 reasons at any time if he wanted to make up a story. The current Blood Flame Order, or to be more precise, Madame Halder's Blood Flame Order, is like a stray dog. They ran from Xia City to T City, and it's said that they aren't doing too well. Under these circumstances, the second-in-command of the order accompanied this so-called Mr. Mo to Saga City to purchase property and then conducted research and experiments midway. What a touching logic. Dor opened his mouth, but he suddenly discovered that he had nothing to say. Captain Jimmy used his terrible mood to make groundless and far-fetched claims. He forcefully wrung out a complete logical chain. Following his train of thought, even Mende felt that this Mr. Mo was very suspicious. Hold on, this has nothing to do with us. Really? Are you sure? After a series of debates, Captain Jimmy felt that he had returned to his peak. He even laughed. He extended his hand and drew a circle in the air. He pointed out, "Why do I feel that their attitude is very unfriendly?" While Captain Jimmy was talking loudly in the warehouse at the dock, Snake Tongue furrowed her brows several hundred meters away on the yacht. That fellow on the other side was pestering her endlessly, but his senses were quite sharp. Especially when that group of people had entered a state of combat readiness. They were connected to each other and formed a network. They naturally formed a highly integrated offensive and defensive fortress on the mental plane. The spell probing she was used to before now seemed a bit rash. Her surveillance made the other party react, but it wasn't that easy to get rid of it. As an outstanding cursemancer, she was an expert when it came to curses, stimulation and control of living creatures. At this distance, as long as there were mosquitoes or crawling insects in the warehouse, they could form a monitoring network. They wouldn't be affected by ordinary mental attacks. At most, they could see the information directly or indirectly. But she still had to say the growth rate of technology was truly fast. Snake Tongue had dealt with Deep Blue walkers quite a few times in the past. In fact, ever since the Deep Blue platform appeared, it had always been the focus of the Inner World's research. Ability users had very complicated feelings towards this group of people that obtained extraordinary power through the transformation of the human body. Snake Tongue was no exception. But after wasting half a year in the cloud world and returning to reality, Snake Tongue discovered that she needed remedial lessons. More and more characters worthy of attention appeared on the Deep Blue platform. Let's not talk about superstars like Tian Bang, who was the #1 person below the extraordinary level. She felt that there were quite a few noteworthy points in this operation team she had randomly encountered. The problem right now was that Captain Jimmy had accidentally hit the nail on the head. He had a temperament of an unpredictable bomb. Luonen might not like this news. Li's call came in just as she was thinking. There weren't any pleasantries. She just wanted to remind her that Luo Nan would soon return to the yacht and that she needed to pay attention to matters during this time. It looked like the situation was quite urgent. Halfway through the conversation, Luo Nan became the one speaking. Your Excellency. Snake Tongue's attitude immediately changed subtly. She carefully memorized the instructions and repeated them before responding, Hey, I understand. Snake Tongue immediately got up when the call ended and headed to the yacht's storage area. At Luo Nan's request, a raw material processing area had been temporarily partitioned off. It was mainly used to process the compound raw materials he used daily, extract nutrients and the like. Originally it wasn't that particular. But in the past 2 days, it seemed that he had obtained a series of pre-processing techniques from an expert that could effectively increase his usage efficiency. Snake Tongue was a cursemancer. She was quite accomplished in the field of pharmacology, so she took over this heavy responsibility. She provided Luo Nan with the rough processing materials he needed for his experiments every day. It was said that these materials were used to make something like a sarcolemma. As she passed by the outer deck, she saw the commercial vehicle that had returned to the dock at Li's request turn around to pick up Luo Nan. The capricious orders were clearly controlled by Luo Nan's flickering inspiration. In fact, the yacht, which had already entered a half-resting state, became active once more under Luo Nan's will. The crew ran up and down, taking their respective positions. Snake Tongue had just finished preparing the materials she had accumulated over the past few days in the storage area when she heard the low hum of an electric motor. This was proof that Luo Nan had already arrived at the dock. Afterwards, the yacht would temporarily take him away from this densely populated area and into the depths of North Mountain Lake. Chapter 846. The commercial car went back and forth. Luo Nan boarded the boat, the yacht left the shore, and the boat drove into the center of the lake. There were no accidents in this series of processes. They were extremely compact, without any buffer gaps. Such a rhythm was rare for Luo Nan, at least from Snake Tongue's point of view. Ever since they got to know each other for a long time, the impression Luo Nan gave her in most situations was that he spent long periods of time pondering and delving. He was in an illusory and mysterious state of emptiness. Occasionally they would interact and he would be cold and hard, piercing into the deepest depths of one's heart. The current scene was more like someone whipping him from behind or rushing to the front to fight an intense battle. Snake Tongue originally wanted to report the latest intelligence on monitoring Captain Jimmy and the others, but she couldn't find an opportunity to interrupt. After Luo Nan boarded the yacht, he went directly to the warehouse area. He checked the raw materials provided by Snake Tongue and confirmed that they were sufficient. He didn't say anything, but a layer of smoke spread out from his body. The temporarily separated warehouse area wasn't that big. Whether it was Snake Tongue or Lu, they were soon enveloped by the smoke. Their figures became hazy and indistinct. What was this? Lu turned her head in shock, wanting to communicate with Snake Tongue. However, the two lacked tacit understanding in the end. Snake Tongue didn't pay attention to Lu. She just silently watched the roiling smoke beside her, as well as the more detailed components within. Snake Tongue wasn't able to discern too many details because her psychic senses were greatly restricted within this smoke. And the more she delved into the details, the more fuzzy her probing mental senses became. It was as if countless fine blades were sliced into pieces and scattered randomly. They were turned upside down and confused. In the end, she simply doubted her usual self-logic. This feeling was terrible. More importantly, it stimulated Snake Tongue. It made her remember that she had vaguely experienced this scene before. Yes, the cloud world, the mist maze. This was the bizarre location where Luo Nan had attacked, oppressed, and bound Gongqi. Snake Tongue often boasted that she was experienced and knowledgeable, but she had never seen such a bizarre and despairing world in her entire life. It was precisely there that Snake Tongue and death overlapped. Perhaps it was just a hair's breadth of difference. No matter when she thought about it, she couldn't get rid of the feeling of suffocation. It was also there that she completely lost her freedom of life. Perhaps this included the future that she could look forward to. Snake Tongue's gaze shifted and swept over Li's blurry face. This woman was curiously looking around as if she didn't know anything. This allowed Snake Tongue to have an even clearer judgment regarding the mist maze. That place was undoubtedly Luo Nan's top secret. Perhaps it was the core source of all of his abilities. Think about it. A sandstorm maze formed from 1 trillion domain fragments. Any random fragment from the maze would be a rare treasure on the inner world plane. How much of it was mixed in the smoke that filled the air? That place was a terrifying prison, but at the same time, it was also an incredible treasure trove. Even with Luo Nan's strength, he absolutely could not let it see the light of day for a long time to come. Unfortunately, he was involved. Even if he wasn't killed, he would have to pay an extra price. Snake Tongue was lost in a rare moment of absent-mindedness due to the awakening of her terrible memories. When her attention returned, she discovered that a dark red exoskeleton frame had appeared within the mist, sticking close to Luo Nan's torso at some unknown time. Where did this come from? The dark red was a rather eye-catching color within the ash-white smoke. It seemed to be flowing endlessly, as if it was the blood contained within the entire frame. Within the flowing bloody light, the connective tissue and muscle tissue fragments of the same hue seemed to be woven by invisible needles and threads. They stuck close to the surface of the skeleton, gradually taking shape. Correspondingly, the rough processing materials Snake Tongue had prepared, as well as the nutrients specially used to replenish the human body's energy, were consumed at an astonishing rate. They were swallowed into the depths of the smoke. Luo Nan possessed the ability to rapidly produce human cells and tissues, or perhaps he possessed the tools to do so. Snake Tongue still remembered how shocked she was the first time she saw such a scene. But now she was completely accustomed to it, and she knew that Luo Nan's ability had its limits. In the end, the exoskeleton frame was unable to form a complete body. It merely formed a thin layer of muscular-like structure. It wrapped around and covered most of the skeleton, and it stretched and contracted endlessly. It caused the entire frame to tighten and deform, but it also fit the contours of Luo Nan's body. Snake Tongue had seen a similar scene more than once in the past few days. The speed at which it formed was much faster than this time. Yes, she felt that Luo Nan's speed at forming the muscular-like structure was much slower today. There were even some areas that were a bit hesitant. Snake Tongue had just thought of this when she saw the mostly formed muscular-like structure in the chest and abdomen region of the exoskeleton frame burn into ashes. Bionic tissue began to grow wildly at the edges of the gap, spreading and bonding to fill the gap. There was a change in the design train of thought. Snake Tongue was able to guess this, and Luo Nan spoke at this time. I remember that there are still some exoskeleton accessories here? There are, but they aren't as complete as the ones in the warehouse at Claw Island and the hydroelectric power station. Yin Lu reacted quickly. She had long since given up on probing into the profound principles behind Luo Nan's actions. She just waited to deal with the corresponding mundane matters. It's in the other room. I'll go get it? Yeah. See if there are any RAC model wires. I'll have to deal with the sensitivity a bit. Yin Lu turned around and left. Luo Nan didn't idle while waiting. He opened up the virtual work area, and an extremely complex configuration design was already drawn on it. Snake Tongue shifted her gaze and swept it over. He felt dizzy. However, Luo Nan took the initiative to point at her. In a bit, you'll have to help me install the wires. I need to make adjustments immediately. I can't free up my hands. Yeah. Snake Tongue didn't have any leeway to refuse. Can you understand the design diagram? I can't. Snake Tongue's response was extremely decisive. This was absolutely not the time to act. Otherwise, she would be the one to lose face in a bit. Luo Nan could understand. It doesn't matter. This is just a temporary reinforcement. It mainly depends on the finesse of the operation. Just do it step by step according to what I said. Yeah, I still need to explain the basic logic. He made a hand gesture, and the configuration diagram on the virtual work area was simplified by quite a bit in an instant. It revealed a rather distinct three-layer structure of inner, middle, and outer. Right now I'm using the lamination interference technology. According to my research with Dean Wan, this is a kind of disguise technique that uses perfection to imitate imperfection. First, I do addition, then I do subtraction. Right now I'm doing addition. The basic logic is like this. Through the configuration design, I take the imperfect situation of the main body, and through the transition of the exoskeleton and other auxiliary frames, I gradually fill in and make up for it. I map it onto my strongest spacetime configuration, forming a relatively perfect mapping. The meaning of this perfect is quite complicated, but it's something like this. Understand? The first thing Snake Tongue thought of was the attributive word strongest before the spacetime configuration. Why did she feel that Luo Nan's strongest point should be mental piercing and control? Chapter 847. The victim's abdomen was meaningless. Snake Tongue cleared her distracting thoughts, and her line of sight pierced through the pervasive smoke. She saw that this blurry area still had certain restrictions. After eliminating the influence of obstacles, a relatively complete circle appeared on the whole. She vaguely understood Luo Nan's meaning. The exoskeleton is basically equivalent to a padding, but it's also an orderly operating system. It filled in the abilities that the body didn't have and increased the power that the body didn't have. The relationship between it and the main body was equivalent to the gear set that His Excellency had mentioned before, that coupling theory. The coupling between the inside and the outside will form an organic whole, amplifying one's own strength and stirring up even greater power in the world. That's right. You were the same back then. You understood it the moment you heard it. Luo Nan grinned his teeth in delight. He was a bit pleasantly surprised. The corner of Snake Tongue's mouth perked up, but the curve of her lips was mostly filled with bitterness. At this moment, the magnificent power raised by the gear set that was embedded in the void surged up from the depths of his memory. Moreover, as the timeline moved forward, it became more and more majestic and unstoppable. Back then he had recklessly used his own small gear to pry open the big gear of the world. Today just his existence alone was already a marvel of the world, unfathomable and unattainable. Such a change only took the time of a nightmare in the cloud world. Perhaps this change itself was a nightmare. At this moment Yinlu came in with the metal box containing the wires. Sir. She paused halfway through her words. Her gaze shifted between Luo Nan's and Snake Tongue's faces. She paused for about a second before she opened the case and displayed the relevant equipment. The RAC wire is here. Luo Nan nodded slightly. He wasn't in a hurry to get into action. Instead he continued to communicate with Snake Tongue about the corresponding concepts. It is indeed a coupling, but there is one thing that is different from the last time. This time I don't need to pry anything. Instead I need to merge with the big gear set of heaven and earth so that it doesn't stand out. But at the same time I need to make my own characteristics stand out. The work of integration will be completed in the addition stage. You must fully realize the coupling effect. This is the foundation. The work of highlighting will be completed in the subtraction stage. You must highlight the sense of design. Now get ready. Yes. Snake Tongue adjusted her breathing and took out the wire from the metal case she had already opened. She gradually understood. Luo Nan's conversation with her was actually to further clarify his train of thought. Therefore, during this period the configuration design of the virtual workspace was adjusted to a certain extent. It felt more concise and clear. In comparison, Snake Tongue's operation phase was lackluster. She just appeared as an AI assistant. She followed Luo Nan's instructions and installed the wires in the designated locations. Snake Tongue had installed a total of over 30 wires, and they were arranged inside and outside the exoskeleton frame. They were like a mixture of neurons, muscle fibers, blood vessels, and other functional tissues. Every time a wire was installed, the exoskeleton frame would react, and it was an obvious change in shape. The muscle membrane structure produced by the transformation would also quickly cover it, making it look like a single entity. Snake Tongue didn't have the time to look at it in detail. She listened attentively to Luo Nan's instructions. She was engrossed in the installation and traction work. When the work was complete, she tried to look at the fruits of her labor as a whole. But she was stunned to discover that the scenery before her eyes was fading away. The smoke that practically covered the entire warehouse area was fading away without end. This wasn't a result of the leakage and decrease in concentration due to the tight seal. Instead, it corresponded to the steps of continuous adjustment. The chaotic dust within the smoke was like a jigsaw puzzle that gradually became orderly. The orderly layers gradually became clear, forming a stable and ethereal structure. It blended together with the surrounding void that she was accustomed to. The exoskeleton frame also blended inside. Within the fading smoke, the dark infrared exoskeleton, which had just pulled the wires and wrapped the muscle membrane, seemed to have been rubbed by an eraser. Its structure, color, and even substance all became faint and fuzzy. Then it disappeared one by one until it was completely hidden. In the end, only Luo Nan's figure remained in the middle of the warehouse area. He stood there quietly with his head slightly lowered. It seemed that he was pondering something. The smoke, the exoskeleton, and all the corresponding scenes were like an illusion. However, one only needed to see that the vast majority of the compound raw material reserves had been consumed and the empty metal case in Yin Li's hands. Luo Nan knew that everything that had just happened was true without a doubt. Snake Tongue thought of Luo Nan's words from a few minutes ago. The large gear set that wanted to merge with heaven and earth. The merging was quite thorough. As for how Luo Nan was able to accomplish this, Snake Tongue really couldn't guess. The operation of this round far exceeded the scope of her knowledge structure. Snake Tongue was stunned and Yin Li's reaction was even greater. She blurted out a question. Is it done? Portion. I still need to test it. Luo Nan flexed and extended his 10 fingers as he spoke. After confirming that his movements were unhindered, he reached out to touch his face. With a slight movement, a smoke-like layer of fine muslin was peeled off. His facial features underwent a subtle change. Snake Tongue and Yin Li suddenly came to a realization. Luo Nan had been using the identity of Mr. Imo for the past few days. His facial features had been modified by the muslin of invisibility. However, after interacting with him for a long time, his unique characteristics had unwittingly caused them to overlook the difference in appearance. From this angle, the disguise was quite a failure. Luo Nan didn't care about the thoughts of others. He used his fingertips to twirl the muslin in his hand, experiencing the marvelous state that existed between the virtual and the real. Then, he tossed it up. Snake Tongue and Yin Li's attention naturally gathered over. The muslin of invisibility was practically weightless due to its special material properties. It easily broke free of gravity. It was like smoke or mist, stretching, shifting, and bobbing up and down in the air. Soon a dozen seconds passed but nothing happened. Another dozen seconds passed. Luo Nan's face was expressionless as he extended his hand and took off the muslin of invisibility. Yin Lu, who had been a chatterbox before, instantly felt extremely embarrassed. Luo Nan didn't say a word. He continued to twirl the muslin with his fingertips, searching for the feeling. The muslin of invisibility was a product of lamination interference technology, but it wasn't the core item. Instead, it was a kind of extension product. It wasn't a natural material. Instead, it underwent the effects of the so-called lamination interference spirit core. It underwent a transformation of quality and energy over the years, absorbing special particles from the outside world to weave itself into a strange object. The lamination interference spirit core was like a shuttle. As long as it existed, it would simultaneously accumulate and weave on both the material and mental planes, endlessly expanding the scale of the muslin of invisibility. It would also memorize a few commonly used patterns, making it easier to realize concealment and camouflage. From this point of view, once the experiment of the lamination interference technology was successful, the experimental product would certainly be able to form a special effect with the muslin of invisibility and vice versa. Let alone a special effect, not even the most basic of interference effects could be seen. It was at this time that Snake Tongue bowed to show her respect. She acted as if she was completely convinced. Your Excellency's divine skill. Chapter 848. Luo Nan didn't show any joy toward Snake Tongue's praise. He continued to twirl the muslin and responded calmly, "It can be considered a success, but the design of the spirit core is still a bit lacking." What are they talking about? Lu was confused. In terms of cultivation, she and Luo Nan really didn't have much of a tacit understanding. She was able to accept this fact, but right now she was completely excluded from Luo Nan and Snake Tongue's small circle. She felt far too uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, Yin Lu adjusted her state of mind and used the most honest method to participate. "Sir, what did you just do?" Examine the interference effect between the constructed gear set and the outside world. Luo Nan chose Snake Tongue's description and the source came from himself. Seeing Yin Li's blank expression, he explained a little more. "I hope to achieve 2 effects. Well, it should be 3 effects. The first is that the newly constructed gear set can be seamlessly embedded into the big gear set of heaven and earth. This is basically achieved." Luo Nan reached out his hand and fiddled with it a few times. He didn't feel any obstruction at all. He gestured to Yin Lu to give it a try. Yin Lu reached out her hand in a daze and without any obstruction she touched Luo Nan's chest. She subconsciously apologized and retracted her arm. However, she bumped into something along the way and her arm was locked down by a solid object, rendering her unable to move. It was also at this moment that Lu realized that there was a slight refraction in the surrounding air with a vague silhouette appearing around her arm. Exoskeleton? This is invisibility. Oh, it's a void layer. Lu immediately thought of the crystal ball in her bag and the devil ray swimming in it. More or less. The demonstrative clamp was released and the exoskeleton frame was embedded back into the sandwich domain. Luonan nodded slightly. This is my strong suit and it's the best state I can reach right now. Unfortunately, the second effect wasn't realized. The connection with the invisible yarn. This means that there are still flaws in the design of the spirit core. Lu didn't really understand this part, but she finally had a vague idea. She didn't delve into the details and continued to ask, then the third effect is... The game character logs into the internet. Oh, it's long-distance mapping. We still have to try it out. Li's cognitive network almost broke again. She was stunned for 2 seconds before continuing, long distance? How far is it? Before Luonan could reply, the latest news came from the intelligence channel. Lu originally didn't want to pay attention to it, but the priority of the information was higher, and it involved the kind of people that needed special attention. The relevant information was directly projected onto the retina. A local bright light phenomenon appeared over the Pacific Ocean. There were signs of extraordinary activity. The intercontinental airships passing through this area were rumored to have been hijacked. The area of the incident was 1,500 kilometers away from Osaka City, and it was highly suspected that the Amaterasu Order was deeply involved. And at this time, Luonan clearly responded, it should be at least 1,400–500 kilometers. Li's body trembled. At the same time she could feel Snake Tongue suddenly raise her head from the side. Her gaze focused on Luonan's face. Luonan saw that Lu didn't have any new questions, so he turned his attention back to the work in front of him. He frowned slightly. I've delayed things a bit. It's impossible to be perfect, Mr. My lord. Lu and Snake Tongue spoke at the same time. They instantly exchanged glances, but this time neither of them had any intention of declining modestly. That airship. The Deep Blue operation team at the warehouse has been affected by the airship incident, and their operations have come to a halt. However, that Captain Jimmy has a few unfavorable associations with us. The importance of the information on both sides, including the depth involved, was different from the very beginning. Lu unconsciously stopped talking and gave way to Snake Tongue. Luonan's gaze also pointed over there. Speaking of which, be it Snake Tongue or Lu, they weren't too sure about Luonan's degree of involvement in the airship incident. But right now, just by looking at his reaction to the word, airship, there was no longer any doubt. Snake Tongue's expression could still be considered calm, but the speed of her heartbeat had unwittingly increased by a level compared to a few seconds ago. Right now, she finally understood the severity of the situation behind Luonan's series of actions. Therefore, she used the most concise and accurate words to summarize Captain Jimmy's nonsense. Once. Then she expressed her own opinion. With Captain Jimmy's restless mood, it's very likely that he will make a rash move. If Master's current focus of attention is placed far away, we need to prepare a response plan as much as possible in advance. We can't let it become a negative interference. Snake Tongue had already spoken quite bluntly. At the very least, Lu understood tacitly. If Luonan really wanted to compete with the major powers of the Amaterasu Order 1,500 kilometers away, then let's not talk about how he was going to accomplish this. As the rear, absolutely no problems could happen to Ban City. Even in normal times, this would be a very troublesome matter, let alone now. Snake Tongue and Lu both looked at Luonan's reaction. Indeed, Luonan furrowed his brows. Don't tell me we have to have two characters? This is a bit difficult. Let's deal with the airship first. Could they deal with the other side as well? Even Snake Tongue's level of understanding wasn't enough. On the other hand, Lu finally had the leeway to use her brain when it came to mundane matters. She quickly said, I'll immediately contact D-City's side and the boss's side. I'll tell them about Mr. Mo's identity. It'll be good if we can interfere with them a bit. As for Mr. Mo, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. Can we first leave the yacht? Temporarily avoid contact with them just like 10 days ago. Lu made the connection to Luo Nan's mysterious and possibly world-shaking operation last time. It also began with leaving the yacht. We really do need to leave. What Lu said was already within Luo Nan's plans. Since she mentioned it, he didn't say anything more. He simply waved his hand. You guys keep an eye on this side. I'll go greet True God and the Pope. If things go smoothly, it shouldn't take too long. Yes. But Lu suddenly froze on the spot, and Snake Tongue wasn't any better. Luo Nan was truly straightforward and efficient. He simply turned around and headed outside after speaking. The warehouse's exit wasn't in front of him, but the sealed cabin wall of the yacht. The scene of the yacht's cabin wall being torn apart 10 days ago instantly flashed in Li's mind. She subconsciously opened her mouth, but before she could speak, she saw Luo Nan's figure pass through the rack of materials in front of the cabin wall like a phantom. He also passed through the thick cabin wall itself. There were no changes to the scene before him. The only thing missing was the living person. Chapter 849. Luo Nan walked at the bottom of Beishan Lake. To put it more accurately, he rode a self-made bubble to shuttle through the structure of space and time at the bottom of Beishan Lake. What he felt at this time and place was not the pressure of millions and millions of tons of water. Instead, it was the vast and boundless acceptance and rejection of the local structure of space and time that was hard to describe. Luo Nan slightly altered the old-fashioned analogy that Snake Tongue used. He was a temporary creation, a mutated gear set. He wanted to change his original role. He wanted to obtain more authority and occupy a more important position in the great machine and the great production line created by all living things in the world. He undoubtedly had to compete with other gear sets with similar structures, but they were even tighter and sturdier. This was an enormous challenge, and it was extremely intuitive. As Luo Nan walked between the structure of space and time, the pressure was everywhere. It penetrated the outer layer of the space-time bubble and acted upon the embryonic exoskeleton frame. During this time, a portion of the pressure was dispelled by his sandwich domain. Even so, he was still able to clearly hear the vibrating hum of the mutant skeletal material, which had gone through many layers of processing and forging. Occasionally, the sound would be hoarse or sharp. This was a sign of damage to the material structure. This pressure far exceeded the intensity of the water pressure at the bottom of the lake. But the bubble he designed was able to withstand the initial test. It traveled in a straight line through the complex environment at the bottom of Beishan Lake. Whether it was the undercurrent surging in the water layer or the crooked and scattered ruins of the city, they were unable to create any substantial obstruction. There were also the sensitive creatures at the bottom of the lake, including the mutants. They had completely overlooked such a blank target. This was because Luo Nan was walking in another dimension. In a certain sense, he was a part of this world. He was a redundancy that was hard to discover within the established structure of space and time. This was a relatively conservative standby state. Only in this way could the exoskeleton frame, which was not that perfect in its workmanship, be able to endure for a period of time. Luo Nan earnestly sensed the feeling of being in the great gear set and the great production line of the world. Right now, he did not possess the mysterious feeling of becoming one with heaven and earth. He only had a simple feeling of tightness, smoothness, and difficulty when the gears meshed with each other. He used these as a basic comparison to make the corresponding corrections. Gradually, this feeling became more abundant, becoming more exquisite and complicated. Sometimes his reaction couldn't keep up, and it was hard for him to make adjustments in time. Fortunately, this feedback was clear and continuous. It helped Luo Nan adjust his position. From the theoretical ideal state of the laboratory, he adapted step by step to the variables of the real world. Also, they had to test the remote login that had to be realized immediately. I need to adjust my character properly when I log in. I almost forgot. Luo Nan loosened his hand and took out the crystal ball from Li's backpack. He silently merged it into the space-time bubble. It was as if the devil ray inside had been sucked up from a deep well. It approached from afar, its body rapidly enlarging and recovering. Its wing-like pectoral fins undulated up and down as it swam around Luo Nan. From Luo Nan's angle, the two sides were so close that the tip of the devil ray's fin and stinger streaked past his eyelids time and time again. Even though this was a giant mutant, Luo Nan still placed it within a space-time bubble, isolating it from the normal space-time environment. The technique seemed simple, but it was actually peerlessly complex. Luo Nan was able to seamlessly connect such an enormous life form. It was completely built upon Luo Nan's long-term research on the Devil Ray and his even deeper attainments in space-time configuration. But this way the space-time bubble was able to bear an even greater pressure. Hidden injuries had already appeared on part of the exoskeleton frame, and its durability was worrying. But today's matter could not be carried out in a protracted battle. Currently it was too protracted. From the workshop to the yacht and then to the bottom of the lake, it took at least 20 minutes to make a full circle. During this time Luo Nan and the true god practically broke away from each other. Luo Nan borrowed the advantage of pure observation of his soul strength to come and go as he pleased in the abyss region. Luo Nan was barely able to hook onto the true god, making it hard for the true god to come to a conclusion. Otherwise, the true god would have long since turned his attention to Luo Nan and swept through all of Ban City. Even so, the true god was certainly suspicious. Over at Ban City, the search activities originating from the Amaterasu Pure Land on the mental plane continued to intensify and become more and more strict. Human flesh search and offline PK. This was the fundamental train of thought of the true god and the Pope. This matter could happen anywhere, but it could not happen in Ban City. Luo Nan narrowed his eyes slightly. His gaze pierced through the barrier of the void and the rippling waves of water. In a trance he saw a similar environment 1,500 kilometers away. It was also below the surface of the water, but it was nearly 100 meters deep at the bottom of the sea. Luo Nan chose this sort of environment to be the novice village for his new character to log online. To put it bluntly, it was the place where the spacetime bubble would begin its remote mapping. With the support of the Soul Cloak, which covered the entire world and had the condensation ring as its foundation, there was no environment more suitable for exerting power than an environment rich in water molecules. What Luo Nan needed to do was to borrow the Soul Cloak to project the basic configuration design of his main body over. Of course, his consciousness came along with it. Luo Nan's consciousness really seemed to have grown from the bottom of the sea 1,500 kilometers away. He was very familiar with this. He often used similar methods over the past few months to project the core of his own concept into the South Pacific Ocean. He borrowed the abundant water vapor conditions there to play hide-and-seek with the powerful extraordinaries from all over the world. He misled them, embedding the concepts of Enlightenment Palace and a new plane within. Luo Nan even gave this method a name. It was called Luo's Core. From his perspective, Luo's core and lamination interference technology should be equivalent in terms of core. They were both rooted in the configuration system. But the former spent most of their time hiding behind natural phenomena, confusing the public in seeing, forever hiding in the shadows of people's perception. But Luo Nan relied on the lamination interference technology to become the focal point of everything. He controlled the information that was leaked to the outside, turning the fake into the real. He withstood the multidimensional test of extraordinaries. This required the pinnacle of detail. In extreme situations, the nitpicking of details was never a test of one's attitude. It was a test of technique. The conditions of seawater and lake water were different. There was an essential difference between what was real and what was fake. What was fake was fake. Some laboratory designs would naturally reveal their flaws after the environment changed. The cause might just be the change in air pressure, temperature difference, or even salinity. Luo Nan would never have thought of these details when he was constructing his theory. Even now he couldn't consider putting all the conditions in. Otherwise, the configuration design would be cumbersome. His head might explode before he could even face a true god. Luo Nan could only rely on the principles of the lamination interference technology and his own attainments in spacetime configuration to add and subtract. He let the negative feedback of the outside world grind away the mistakes and redundant things. He was currently the redundancy between heaven and earth. But in order to achieve this high-level redundancy, he needed to abandon the low-level design. He needed to grasp the elements that were more in line with the essence. He needed an existence that was infinitely close to reality to be placed there. He needed to obtain the natural feedback of heaven and earth. This was a process of constant grinding and adjustment. It was to the point where Luo Nan ignored the passage of time in the outside world. He ignored the concrete changes until the sunlight pierced through the seawater and illuminated the gloomy world. Ah, I've been discovered. Was it that kind of discovery? Chapter 850. The interference power that came from within the light carried a familiar flavor. This was the unique quality of a true god. It wasn't an absolute thing to say. Even though they were of the same system, the feeling the Pope gave off was more or less the same. In any case, it was the kind of bright, dazzling, fully burning, scorching feeling. This power combined with the rules and laws of the great divine treasure of the propping mulberry tree. It was like a propulsion furnace that supplied energy to the propping mulberry tree. It was also like the entire propping mulberry tree was its fuel. However, there was still a slight difference from the brief confrontation that occurred a few days ago in the wilderness laboratory. Back then, the true God, under the urging of negative emotions, did not hold back at all. The true God tore through the barrier of the void and smashed over. But now, the true God was in a semi-detached state, performing a routine scan. He had accidentally caught the true God pausing for an instant before the true God exerted its power a second time. This tiny disconnect was far too obvious and slow on Luo Nan's current level. He even had the time to adjust a set of configuration details in response to the sudden change in environment. Only then did he stir, allowing the projected spacetime bubble. No, it should be said that the game character he had just created to log in and go online. No matter how tedious, tense, and precise the preparatory work he had done before logging in, no matter how much energy he had consumed, Luo Nan's mood was strangely calm when he truly arrived at the moment of verification. Against the light that illuminated the surrounding seabed, Luo Nan came into contact with the true God's pressure that penetrated through space. He had a rough idea of what was going on. A slight distortion occurred in the structure of the seawater 100 meters deep. A high-frequency vibration existed on the mental plane, destroying the existing environment. It also forced the surrounding living beings to break away from their original rhythm and expose themselves. The true God's methods could not be said to be wrong. In fact, they were quite brilliant. The underwater life forms in the surrounding area were like a sieve. They were screened out as long as they had the slightest bit of suspicion. Immediately after, a scorching mental attack like an electric net came down with a buzz. In 3 to 5 seconds, the lives of over a dozen species, whether they were mutants or ordinary sea creatures, were forcefully stripped away. But at this time, the new character who had just logged in followed the tiny arc of the distorted spacetime structure. It smoothly shuttled back and forth. It was as if the character was sliding on a guideway. Even though there was still a slight dissonance when the gears were engaged and switched, it added a proper texture. On this trajectory, the mental attacks that could have been fatal were like brilliant fireworks. They seemed to explode at a low altitude like stars falling like rain, but in reality they did not hit the ground at all. An error in judgment. Of course, this was a mistake on the part of the true God. His attack had completely missed. From Luo Nan's perspective, this was an excellent piece of evidence. The configuration design idea has passed the test. The conduction and transformation of the soul cloak are also going smoothly. It's basically operating without any problems, but the feedback from the outside world needs to be corrected. What about the degree of realism? The controller at the bottom of North Mountain Lake was still thinking in an orderly manner. But at the same time, the experiencer, who shared the same lineage at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, received a clear, powerful, and admiring mental message from a true God. "You're here. Good job." It was indeed excellent. Luo Nan gave himself a thumbs up without the slightest hesitation. Looking at it from a certain angle, the true God was exposing his own ignorance, and Luo Nan absolutely wouldn't be so kind as to warn him. Luo Nan didn't receive a response, but the true God's transmitted mental message clearly contained impatience. There wasn't the slightest bit of hesitation within it. The soul cloak that completely covered Luo Nan transmitted back feedback. Within the clouds of the stratosphere, the true God's transmitted power made another round of movement. The center of gravity changed and it locked onto the surface of the distant Pacific Ocean. Soon an even more direct response appeared from the depths of the sea. The roots of the Fusang divine tree were rapidly digging in, interweaving into an incorporeal network. The blazing power churned, interfering with each other on the mental and material planes, forming burst after burst of intense light. It was like a photographer's capture operation. The range was correct, but the situation of losing focus was more serious. At least Luo Nan hadn't truly been locked onto yet. Luo Nan had even abandoned many things during this period of time. Perhaps the addition of these things would have been more perfect in theory, but in actual combat in a rapidly changing environment, these were merely meaningless details. The true God wouldn't pay attention to them and Luo Nan didn't need to waste them. The situation was developing in the direction that Luo Nan hoped for. It was absolutely impossible to create a Luo Nan riding a devil ray and directly greet a true god. But he had to make those two believe, at least partially, that Luo Nan was right here without truly seeing Luo Nan face to face. So far Luo Nan had succeeded. Luo Nan maintained his silence. He controlled the space-time bubble to shuttle back and forth within the tight structure of space and time. Whether it was the bottom of Beishan Lake or the Pacific Ocean, it was the same. One was the main body. The other was a projection. But the difference between the two? No, it should be said that there was a common characteristic. It was constantly being modified by the space-time bubble, and it was gradually internalized. It became a kind of instinct, a kind of nearly natural attribute. Before the structure of the space-time bubble collapsed, it was probably like this. In this way, the consciousness of the experiencer grew stronger and stronger. The consciousness of the controller gradually retreated to a secondary position, retreating to a more fundamental level. It was like an iceberg of the subconscious, and it formed an internalized driving force. Luo Nan didn't think too much about complicated problems for the time being. He was like a damn otaku immersed in a game. He went to experience a novel feeling that originated from him, but he had never experienced it before. The bottom of the sea is fine. I'm now above the surface of the sea. Luo Nan took the initiative to change the environment. The space-time bubble changed its trajectory, and it naturally adjusted its operation method. It only took half a second to pass from the high-pressure region at the bottom of the sea to the spacious and graceful night sky. Perhaps there was a thousandth of a second where the sudden change in external conditions caused the gears to bite together. There was some disharmony, but soon, everything returned to a harmonious and natural state. The senses of a true god could be said to be sharp. Luo Nan's reaction was also extremely fast. He was able to capture these minute fluctuations. He could no longer tell whether it was a powerful light or a torrent of energy. It cleaved across the surface of the sea. But he was still a hair too slow. The entire process was just a hair too slow. Whoosh. Luo Nan could feel the impact that practically wiped out all of his efforts. But it still didn't hit, right? At this moment he no longer tried to distinguish the difference between his main body and his projection. He really did enter a state of immersion. He really was playing a game. He was going to experience a relatively perfect Luo Nan, a brand new self that logged online in the same world. The simple and pure Luo core was enough to support this experience. It allowed him to drive the omnipresent soul cloak, to form a closer connection with this world of the sea and sky that was abundant with water vapor. Chapter 851. The region of the soul cloak was fragmented, rising and falling amidst the fine waves of the sea breeze. Luo Nan was within the cogwheel set of the space-time structure. He moved and did not move. What did not move was his role. In the strict structure of time and space, the change opened up an undeserved gap, becoming a redundancy that was originally non-existent. It continued to operate without being directly rejected. What moved was his relative position. From the bottom of the sea to the sky, from the deep water to the clouds, he drove millions upon millions of water molecules to gather and disperse, provoking the senses of a true god. He was like the water spirit of legend. He leaped and shuttled through the water vapor, coming and going unfathomably. This feeling was a bit similar to an out-of-body experience. Ever since Luo Nan's soul cloak covered the entire world, he experienced less and less of this drifting feeling of a kite with its string cut. Luo Nan did not forget for a moment that his soul strength and fleshly body were still in a serious state of imbalance. Though he had the soul cloak's vast coverage to help disperse the imbalance, and he had the complex structure of the sandwich domain to provide a buffer, an imbalance was an imbalance. He had to pay attention to the coupling state of his body and soul frame at all times. He had to maintain a difficult balance between his god gear, which had entered an uncontrollable state of explosive expansion, and his body gear, which was limited by its physical nature. Sometimes thoughts like this would jump out in Luo Nan's mind. I might as well throw away my fleshly body. It's so weak, clumsy, and it always drags me down. Especially when fighting against a powerful enemy. I have to split half of my mental energy to ponder over how to hide this fatal weakness. Of course, the leaping and flickering thoughts of humans were the most unreliable. From a rational point of view, abandoning one's fleshly body was the same as destroying one's foundation in the material world. The mode of existence of life, established over billions of years of evolutionary history, would transform into a phantom of nothingness. Perhaps there would be a certain amount of inertia in a short period of time, making it easier to operate. But in the long run, it was impossible to support the endless cultivation of the future. Whether it was the lessons of blood that had emerged endlessly in the short few decades of Earth, or the rigorous theories of the mysterious civilization displayed by the virtual brain system, all of them emphasized and verified this point from multiple perspectives. Luo Nan was a rational person under most circumstances. It was impossible for the occasional crazy thought to shake the wall of his rationality. He could not let his heart be blinded by lard and step onto a dead end. He was just taking a break from his busy schedule to experience the illusory pleasure of being completely unrestrained. Luo Nan was not completely illusory. In this state, Luo Nan already possessed the foundation of self-sufficient physical laws to a certain degree through the combination and interference of space-time configurations. In fact, half a year ago Luo Nan had used the condensation ring to break through the barrier between the mental and material planes in one fell swoop. He had realized the leap from 0 to 1. He had flown at a speed that exceeded everyone's imagination on this great road to the heavens. From the copulation between the condensation ring and the external neuron to the birth of the soul cloak. From the coupling of the divine chakra and the body chakra to the deep sea scene that was the foundation of the framework. Then, in the form of a soul cloak, it completely broke free from its shackles and extended to cover the earth and many other dimensions of space and time. When Luo Nan's attainments on the mental plane repeatedly broke through the limits of the imagination of ordinary people, the configuration system of the virtual brain system gave Luo Nan a timely path to deepen and feedback. His rapid progress in configuration design, especially in the design of space-time configurations, allowed him to draw support from the omnipresent water molecules of every plane of space and time. He could even draw support from the even more inconceivable structure of space and time itself to construct a material foundation. He could twist the physical laws and temporarily replace a portion of his fleshly body. This gave him a feeling of immersion that was close to reality. Needless to say, there was even the true God, a scene setter. Right now, the true God was no longer making meaningless attempts after repeated fruitless attempts to converse with Luo Nan. Correspondingly, his methods became even more intense. The pitch-black curtain of night between the sea and the sky had already been sliced to pieces by the true God's blazing killing intent. In an area with a diameter of nearly 100 kilometers, a long and narrow band of intense light and lightning was left in the atmosphere. It left marks on the retinas of living beings that were hard to fade away in a short amount of time. The layers were complex and crisscrossed like an inescapable net. Any living being within this area, whether they were swimming in the sea, flying in the air, or floating on the surface of the water, was faced with imminent disaster. Even if they were not directly cut, just the aftershocks of the overlapping vibrations would press down from the mental plane to the material plane. Then the aftershocks would reverse the effects. After a few rounds of interference, a high-temperature furnace of boiling poisonous gas was formed. The violent killing intent of an extraordinary was far deadlier than any poison in the world. The true God was absolutely not the kind of idiot who wouldn't turn back until he ran into a wall. Don't look at how he had chased Luo Nan for a long time without success. He had other methods of dealing with this process. The projection of the Fusang divine tree shot through the air within this land of death. Its incorporeal roots extended outwards, greedily devouring the flesh, blood, and life force of the surrounding living beings. It borrowed the nourishment of the boiling emotions between life and death to gradually turn from a projection of nothingness into reality. At the very least, the power descending from the abyssal region grew more and more real and terrifying. At the same time, it formed an even more powerful compression effect on the surrounding void. The true God seemed to have sensed something. Having lost a reliable fulcrum of believers, it was very difficult for the true God to display a direct method like he did a few days ago in the wilderness. But the method of boiling a frog in warm water possessed a certain degree of feasibility. It manifested the true God's clear train of thought that was the complete opposite of his violent actions. The undulating undulations of his soul cloak were weakening in regularity. This was the result of the water molecules pervading the atmosphere suffering substantial damage. This was also the result of the warping and deformation of the structure of space and time. It was as if Luo Nan was playing a game of parkour. He had to find a relatively safe route in this vile environment. He had to avoid the projected space-time bubble from colliding head-on with the true God's Fusang divine tree system. Fortunately, this game had a time limit and a finish line. The true god's methods had already partially exceeded the scope of the Fusang divine tree system. It was the type of overclocking. Don't look at the oppressive warm water on the plane of reality. Compared to the abyssal region, it was already a volcanic eruption-like impact and turbulence. This was a good thing. Even with the true god's abilities, it was impossible to maintain this impact force for a long period of time over 1,000 kilometers. Therefore Luonan knew what he had to do. His consciousness anchored the destination within the intermittent soul cloak and the warping void gap. It was the intercontinental airship that was gradually slowing down. It was already beginning to deviate from its course. It was also the location of the trap set up by the true god and the Pope. Luonan could more or less guess the situation over there. But no matter what, it was better for everyone to meet face to face. Chapter 852. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain of this flight. After careful evaluation, I am sorry to inform you that this flight will be turning around and returning. Yukawa Aisuk was sitting sideways on his seat with most of his legs stuck in the aisle. His body was slack and he was still trying to digest the changes that had happened before and after he fainted. He was not in a good state. The aftereffects of forcefully attaching his soul had yet to subside. His skull was buzzing and occasionally there was a sharp tinnitus. Under such circumstances he automatically filtered out most of the broadcast information of the flight, leaving only the most important word: return. His eyeballs moved and he glanced sideways from the corner of his eye. The key factor that caused all this was right in front of him. Less than 3 meters away, the puppet controlled by the Pope like Yukawa Aisuk was sitting sideways on his seat facing the aisle with his elbows on his knees and his body slightly leaning forward. This posture had not changed for a long time. But compared to the moment when Yukawa Aisuk opened his eyes, this puppet that looked like a business elite seemed to have been sucked dry of blood and water. All that was left was a skinny silhouette like a mummy. There was almost no breath coming in and out of its mouth and nose. With such damage to its body, it was already a miracle that it could maintain the most basic vitality. It would be difficult to do anything more than that. But to the Pope this was not a problem at all. The Pope's consciousness was still here, calmly calculating and living within his means to maintain the puppet's breath. At the same time, everyone in the first-class cabin still had to rely on him to survive. It was precisely because this breath was too weak that everyone in the spacious cabin held their breaths. In most cases they were like wooden statues. Yukawa Aisuk was the same. No one restrained him, but in this kind of atmosphere, the only things he could use were his eyes and thoughts. In the beginning he only looked at his surroundings dizzily, passively accepting the drastic changes that happened after the nightmare. As time passed, his mushy brain began to slowly recover. Although this kind of recovery first brought about a sense of pain. Yukawa Aisuk saw the virtual workspace in front of the Pope's puppet, saw the mimicry of the spiritual sea, and saw the continuous appearance of chaotic ripples. Of course he had heard and seen how the Pope taught by Xinyan how to operate the corresponding equipment. He almost didn't dare to think too deeply about the logic behind it. His mouth was full of bitterness. If possible, he hoped to delete all the orders and bargaining records related to the mimicry generator a few days ago, both in reality and in people's memories. However, this was only wishful thinking. Perhaps the relevant information was already placed on the Pope's desk, just waiting for an opportunity to act up. When I go back to Ban City I must. Can I not go back? Speaking of which, it was absolutely impossible for Yukawa Aisuk to leave the Pope puppet's side. As long as he recalled the scene where his mind felt as if he was trapped in a prison, his body involuntarily being controlled by others, fear and despair would follow him like a shadow, and there was no way to get rid of it. With the Pope by his side, Luonan wouldn't come again, right? Yukawa Aisuk adjusted his line of sight and looked at the porthole on the other side of the aisle. The first thing he saw was Kitano Suzuto's stout back. His head bodyguard's mind was no longer on his job. Instead he was focused on observing the scene outside the porthole. Yukawa Aisuk could understand this. This was because at this moment, there was a strong light burning marks on the airship's porthole from time to time. At first the marks were blurry and intermittent, but they became clearer and denser. That was, the true god has captured Luonan's position. I hope it's true this time. Bai Xinyan, who was in the back seat, spoke as she adjusted the parameters of the equipment. Her tone was very pragmatic, but because she was too pragmatic she didn't seem to pay much attention to details. As she spoke, the deformed sound of the atmosphere penetrated the airship's armor and transmitted inside. It rumbled in everyone's ears. This was the power of a true god. Who knew if it was his emotions? Bai Xinyan smiled faintly. But there is one thing that can be confirmed. Luonan didn't successfully escape. His judgment was correct. The mummified Pope puppet didn't respond. Clearly, the Pope didn't want to waste his limited resources on idle chatter. On the other hand, Yukawa Aisuk's thoughts were still wandering. He subconsciously looked at his wristwatch. 22:42. It had been almost 20 minutes since he woke up. It was about the same amount of time since the most recent capture by a true god. During this period of time, almost everyone felt that Luonan had escaped. But now the Pope was waiting silently. This perfectly displayed the difference in judgment between extraordinaries and normal people. But looking at it from another angle, Luonan, the bandit who could deprive others of their mental autonomy at any time, had endured under the eyes of a true god and the Pope for over 20 minutes. He had nearly exhausted the last drop of the Pope puppet's blood essence. He had almost succeeded. Unfortunately, he had failed on the verge of success. This was how Yukawa Aisuk understood it. Why would he think of taking the initiative to provoke such a person? Every time he thought of this, Yukawa Aisuk felt as if a handful of iron sand had been shoved into his chest, rubbing against it repeatedly. In any case, he should have let the true god and the Pope succeed this time. They should have killed that bastard. But in case they didn't, Yukawa Aisuk subconsciously shivered. It was at this time that the cool bottle rested on the back of his hand. He almost subconsciously pushed it away, only to discover that something was wrong halfway through. It was a bottle of water from Bai Xinyan. Thank you. Yukawa Aisuk subconsciously took it. He still remembered the warning and reminder Bai Xinyan gave him in that nightmare, before he completely lost control of his body. This was a favor. But correspondingly, there were still some doubts in his heart that had yet to be cleared up. Just from today's incident alone, did he really provoke that uninvited bandit? He did offend Luonan quite badly. Taking the airship far away from Ban City really gave Luonan the opportunity to make a move. But there was a faintly discernible sense of dislocation. What was going on? Yukawa Aisuk shook his wrist, causing the bottle of mineral water to shake as well. It made a hua-hua sound. Perhaps he should do more research. For example, he should give Ban City a call. Most of the time he was driven by his instincts. He did whatever he thought of. For a moment he forgot about the situation in front of him. He found the communication number of his subordinate, Takemoto Shigeru, and was about to make a call. What can you see like this? You might as well drink it quickly. Bai Xinyan's voice interrupted at this time, disrupting Yukawa Aisuk's plan. Yukawa Aisuk was a bit stupefied. Why did her words not connect? Did she miss something in the middle? That was indeed the case. At this time, Kitano Sukito, who had been observing the scene outside the porthole, had already turned around. He saw his boss's expression and coughed lightly. Miss Bai is talking about the problem of Luonan's extraordinary power acting as a medium. Luonan is an expert in manipulating water. Kitano Sukito was giving a reminder. His technique was a bit crude, but it was also the result of the current tense situation. It was hard for people to care about meaningless etiquette and face. They were straightforward with few decorations. Yukawa Aisuk didn't quite understand, but he didn't bother to hide it. So, he is one of the few people in the world with the most profound attainments in the condensation ring. Perhaps he is second only to Her Majesty Empress Wu. The condensation ring is currently the most efficient configuration technology known to probe into the water molecule level. Bai Xinyan pointed at the mimicry image of the mental sea. She also pointed at the corner of the image. She made some notes based on the changes in the image. Right now we can basically confirm that every time he appears, the water molecules in the atmosphere are abnormally active. The bubbles in the bottle of water were quite obvious just now. I was wondering if this was due to some sort of resonance effect. The corner of Yukawa Aisuk's eye twitched a few times. The bottle of water in his hand suddenly turned into a red-hot soldering iron, sticking to the flesh of his palm. It was not easy to hold it, nor was it easy to throw it away. After a few seconds, Yukawa Aisuk finally made up his mind. He gritted his teeth and said, "Then go ask him." Bai Xinyan smiled. She gestured to Yukawa Aisuk to take a good look at the current state of the Pope's puppet. The latter's stiff, mummified appearance was the best reason. Yukawa Isaac took a deep breath. It was strange. After the previous round of torment, the atmosphere that made people dare not even breathe had become lively. Although the Pope's consciousness was probably still watching everything coldly, or maybe he was silently keeping score. At least for now, he didn't have the intention to blame anyone, let alone the strength to do so. Whether it was a brilliant realization or a broken pot, Yukawa Isuke's breathing had indeed become a lot livelier. The corner of his mouth twitched. He threw the bottle of water in his hand back to Bai Xinyan. You came to this conclusion after observing for such a long time? Bai Xinyan caught it firmly. She unscrewed the cap and took a big gulp without any misgivings. She exhaled a long breath, looking like she was drinking fine wine. I didn't need to observe to come to this conclusion. Since you made a move against him, did you not read Persona? Persona. Oh, I did. Yukawa Isuke still had an impression of it. The target of this intelligence analysis, named Persona Mask, was Luo Nan. The information had been published more than half a year ago. At that time, Luo Nan was using the cage theory to sweep away the traditional soul theory of the inner world. It was quite popular for a time, but the analysis itself was a bit secretive. The follow-up was not followed up in time, so it slowly lost its popularity. The version in Yukawa Isuke's hands also included the comprehensive analysis of various sources by his family's intelligence personnel. The research was more comprehensive than the one on the market. But what did Bai Xinyan mean by mentioning it? Bai Xinyan took a big gulp of mineral water. Her eyes wandered as if she was tipsy. According to the logic of the Persona Mask, Professor Luo has 3 basic faces: rationality, strength, and weakness. Which face are we facing now? It's rationality. It wasn't Yukawa Isuke who answered. It was the Pope's puppet that let out a buzzing sound. Chapter 853. Yukawa Isuke confirmed that it was the papal puppet who spoke. The puppet's lips moved slightly as it made a sound. But other than that, there was no other change. The dim pupils were still pointing at the spiritual sea mimicry map. Your Majesty also watches Persona? On the other side, Bai Xinyan quickly changed the topic of conversation. Her reaction was lively and quick, a stark contrast from the honest operator a few minutes ago. In fact, ever since Bai Xinyan took the initiative to speak and handed over the bottle of water, her attitude had changed subtly. This made Yukawa Isuke wonder if he was just a prelude to the previous round of conversation. While he was suspicious, Yukawa Isuke was actually listening attentively to hear how the Pope would respond. But before he could do that, another wave of low vibrations entered the cabin. The intensity of the sound wave was average, but it just so happened to resonate with the structure of the airship. For a moment, the cabin windows and seats were buzzing, and the vibrations numbed everyone's limbs and lumbar spine. Obviously, it was not only the first-class cabin that was experiencing this. Yukawa Isuke could already hear the screams from the other cabins. To be honest, Yukawa Isuke was also a little panicked. At this moment, the papal puppet's whisper sounded again in the buzzing vibration. Shrink. Yukawa Isuke could no longer understand the professional jargon behind it. Bai Xinyan reacted quickly and started a new round of operation on the spiritual sea mimicry map. The scale of the spiritual sea mimicry map seemed to be increasing, showing more details. Of course, probably only the Pope and Bai Xinyan could understand it. What Yukawa Isuke saw was a simple electrocardiogram on the interface, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, moving up and down. But forgive his poor eyesight, even if the details in some areas had increased, there was no obvious change on the whole. Only a professional would be able to figure out the trick from this. It doesn't seem to be suitable. Bai Xinyan's voice sounded again as if she was regretting it. But in the current situation it sounded awkward no matter how one listened to it. The papal puppet did not make any obvious movements. Beneath its half-closed eyelids, it still vaguely gazed at the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. Just when everyone thought that this scene would continue, a low mosquito-like voice rang out. What do you think? It's just not very suitable. The Pope puppet did not waste any more energy to speak, only glancing over with its gloomy and lightless eyes. His cold gaze got rid of the casual air that had just appeared in Bai Xinyan's body. She instinctively bowed, and the smile on her lips became much more restrained. Please forgive me, Your Highness. I didn't speak clearly. Actually, it was your highness who helped me to roughly understand the design of the mimicry image of the spiritual sea. That's how I came up with this idea. If there's anything I don't understand, I hope your highness can enlighten me. After talking for a while, Bai Xinyan went straight to the point. The parameters set up by your majesty are based on the airship tourists. It's the structure of the spiritual sea built by the airship tourists. This structure was more in line with the main background from last time in Ban City. The results that appeared were more comparable. But the problem was that His Majesty and the Lord True God had descended. Junior Luonan didn't dare to linger. He fled far away and only played around in the periphery. The structure built by the hundreds of passengers on the yacht was clearly insufficient in terms of coverage. Therefore, I boldly guess that your highness should take the initiative to graft this layer of structure with the power projected by the Lord True God. He forcefully spread it out and expanded its coverage, allowing Luonan's methods to leave traces on it as much as possible. The Pope puppet did not have any obvious reaction to Bai Xinyan's narration. Next to her, Yukawa Aishuk listened very seriously. Of course, he didn't quite understand, but his imagination was pretty good. The scene of the Pope spreading out a thick pancake and sending it to the true God's hands to spin in circles or cast a net to catch fish appeared in his mind. That was probably what it meant. The Pope didn't object. That meant he acknowledged it. Wait a minute. Weren't Yukawa Aishuk and the others also passengers on the airship? In other words, they were also part of the ingredients for this pancake? Bai Xinyan seemed to have heard his thoughts as he let his imagination run wild. She tilted her head and smiled. Yes. The distance between us and Professor Luo is much closer than we imagined. It's like an oil slick on the surface of the water or a fly sticker. Yukawa Aishuk's expression was a bit stiff. He turned to look at his head bodyguard. Kitano Sukuto stood upright like a wooden stake. Yukawa Aishuk could get his answer from this guy's reaction. The problem right now is that Luonan's methods are a bit unreasonable. It's beyond my expectations. The Pope puppet's cracked and bloodless lips opened and closed slightly. Its voice was weak and vague, but its meaning was clear. He can hide, and he can counterattack. The voice stopped for a few seconds. It seemed as if it was unwilling to mention it. It seemed as if it was pondering over its words. But in the end, it still determined Luonan's behavior. It's very pure. Bai Xinyan didn't seem to understand. She asked, "What do you mean by pure?" The papal puppet wanted to continue speaking, but what flowed from its mouth this time was dark red froth of blood. Bai Xinyan let out an ah. She still spoke in a regretful tone. "This body has finally reached its limit. Your Majesty, is there any other way to persevere?" As soon as these words left her mouth, Bai Xinyan immediately received a dozen gazes from all around her. Especially the bodyguards who were trying their best to hide in the shadows. They looked like they were about to collapse. The problem was that their wills were never taken into consideration. That included Bai Xinyan. In the next second, an indescribable shadow filled the eyes of everyone in the first-class cabin. Yukawa Aishuk felt as if he had taken a step into the shade of the branches and leaves under the sun. To be more precise, he himself was part of the shade. He faced the blazing sun while weaving the shadows. Everyone in the first-class cabin was probably doing this. This shade was not meant for them to enjoy. The Pope puppet was completely motionless. Having used up its last drop of blood essence, it had completely turned into a dried corpse. Meanwhile, the Pope's will, which had borrowed the existence of its corpse, conveniently entered the tree's shade. Using an exquisite guiding power, it intersected the branches and leaves in all directions, ultimately forming a tree nest that was the structure of a spiritual vessel. A wonderful feedback came. Yukawa Aishuk suddenly realized that he had a bit of the ability to communicate in the mental realm. This ability was undoubtedly given to him by the Pope. It was also decided by his current state. In the end, the Pope switched to the mode of mental projection. This time there was no one to act as a power bank. It was probably because the same method was not suitable for a third time. He could only settle for the next best thing. Thus, everyone present, including Yukawa Aishuk, became the framework of the so-called tree nest. As for what the tree nest was, not many people understood. It was because it was a construct on the mental plane. According to Yukawa Aishuk's understanding, the Pope used the magnetic fields of their lives to build a temporary nest, or safe haven. This provided the conditions for a weak consciousness to stay in space. No one knew the specifics of the situation. Only one thing was certain. The Pope's consciousness could directly appear in their minds, turning into images and sounds to achieve communication. This is a mental technique, but it is not used on the emotional level of Yukawa. Instead, it comes and goes, directly affecting the space-time structure. The Pope seamlessly continued his previous evaluation and analysis of Luo Nan. This was an explanation for purity. Yukawa Aishuk should not have understood this. But in this tree nest shadow state, he muddle-headedly understood a lot of conceptual knowledge. He also possessed the ability to make preliminary analysis. It was as if there was a built-in AI operating. Because it was purity, it broke away from the level of the Pope's design. Although it would still have an impact, this impact was no different from the impact of nature's wind, rain, thunder, and lightning. It was practically impossible to capture Luo Nan's special interference mode through the sea of consciousness mimicry. In other words, the Pope's plan was ruined. Yukawa Aishuk seemed to have split into two sides. One side had the normal thoughts of Immortal, and the other floated on the supernatural plane. He did not even have the time to fear before he was pushed forward by the surging pressure of information. He could only do his best to adapt to his current state. The Pope was still communicating with Bai Xinyan. It's still useful. At least we know the upper limit of Luo Nan's level. He's much stronger than expected. And we also know that Luo Nan's forte is not in making a fuss over people's emotions. Instead, he bypassed the path of controlling other people's fates and entered the domain of pure configuration design. Especially space-time configurations. It's still related to the situation in Ban City. Without the restrictions of the material plane, the Pope was a lot more talkative. And it was the exquisiteness of his words that made Yukawa Aishuk think, I wonder how Luo Nan feels when he's being studied by an extraordinary? Amidst his thoughts, Yukawa Aishuk suddenly felt that the sunlight behind him had suddenly become extremely hot. At the same time, his fleshly body also captured a new wave of lightning and thunder. This made him understand. Becoming a tree nest, embedding itself into the mental framework, meant that it was closer to the battlefield. In a trance, a part of Yukawa Aishuk's consciousness was thrown into the depths of the hazy void. He touched upon the ever-changing battlefield of the true God and Luo Nan. Even though his brain was now implanted with the AI, he was still unable to experience the exquisite details. He could only feel some vague symbolic feelings. Luo Nan really did seem to be embedded in the depths of the void. It was like the hidden chain lock of a precision machine. When it twisted and turned, there would be some deformation inside. But on the outside, it was always in a stable and smooth state. It satisfied the psychological instinct of people to pursue order. Not only did it conform to people's psychology, but it also conformed to the laws and principles of the world.